What's good, history friends? Before we go into the absolute nightmare that was my life wandering through 1800s, smash that like button, drop your wildest theories in the comments, and hit subscribe because tonight we're going deep into some horror stories that makes Netflix's true crime docs look like Disney movies. And ring that notification bell because you do not want to miss what happens when I stumble into not one, but two of the most twisted murder cases in British history. My name's irrelevant. I was nobody then and honestly, still nobody now. But back in 1827, I was just a 19-year-old kid who thought leaving home would be all adventure and freedom. Boy, was I wrong. What I got instead was a front-row seat to humanity's darkest impulses, and let me tell you, it was like walking into a real-life horror movie, except the popcorn was stale bread and the screaming was, well, actual screaming. It's March 1827. I'm 19, broke as a joke, and absolutely done with my old man's expectations. Sound familiar? Yeah, some things never change. While you guys are dropping out of college to become TikTok influencers, I dropped out of life to become a, well, professional wanderer, I guess. I packed my entire life into one ragged satchel. We're talking Oliver Twist meets Bear Grylls, but with zero survival skills and the emotional intelligence of wet cardboard. My plan? Walk until I found something interesting. What I found was a whole lot more than I bargained for. Stay put, and I'd rot in poverty, marry some girl I didn't love, and fade away like yesterday's news. Or bolt, choose loneliness, mystery, adventure. I chose the latter, packing a knapsack with jerky, a Colt revolver, fresh off the line, felt like holding power itself, and dreams bigger than the Mississippi. The crisp autumn leaves crunching under my boots, the bite of frost in the air mix in with the salty tang of harbor fog. I hit the road west, thumbin' rides on wagons, dodging highwaymen who eyed me like fresh meat. Psychologically, I was running from grief, chasing that American dream, manifest destiny, they called it. But deep down, it was power dynamics at play. Me versus the world, a nobody talking on the untamed frontier. Kinda like today's influencers hustling for likes, but with real bullets flying. Yeah, I was green as a frog in a pond. First night out, I tried campin' and woke up with a raccoon stealing my boots. "Get outta here, you furry bandit," I yelled. Modern equivalent. Losing your phone to a pickpocket in NYC annoying, but character building. But horror creeps in early. Whispers in the wind at night, like voices calling my name. Was it the isolation playing tricks? Or something darker pulling me toward that fateful graveyard? Stick around, folks, the real chills are coming. If you're hooked, like and subscribe now. I'm in Easton, Connecticut, stumbling into Union Cemetery under a blood moon, one of America's most haunted spots. Folks, with a history datin' back to the 1600s, graves crooked like bad teeth, mist curling round mossy stones, the scent of damp earth and decay hitting me like a punch. No street lights back then, just my lantern flick-errin' shadows that danced like demons. It's a crisp October night, the kind of cold that seeps into your bones like bad whiskey. No modern floodlights or GPS apps to guide ya, just my trusty lantern swinging from a hook, spillin' feeble yellow light that made the graves look like jagged fangs poking up from the earth. The air? Thick with the musty punch of wet soil, rot tin leaves, and something sweeter, like faded lilacs from a forgotten funeral. Mist rolled in low, curling around my boots like ghostly fingers, and every step crunched on gravel that sounded like bones snapping underfoot. Owls hooted in the distance, but it felt like they were mocking me, "Fool, fool." And that blood moon hanging overhead cast everything in a rusty glow, turning the world into a nightmare straight outta one of those Edgar Allan Poe tales I'd read by candlelight back home. I was there by accident, or so I thought, dodging a storm, seeking shelter among the dead, 'cause, hey, they don't complain about company. But as I hunkered down against a weathered oak, that's when she materialized. Out of the fog, silent as a sigh, came Annabelle, or at least, that's the name she whispered later, like a secret carried on the wind. Pale as fresh cream, her skin glowed unnatural in the moonlight, draped in a tattered Victorian gown that fluttered without a breeze. Long black hair cascading like a waterfall of ink, Framlin eyes that burned with a sorrow deeper than the Atlantic. "Lost soul," she breathed, her voice rustling like dry leaves skittering across stone soft, but echoing in my skull long after. Man, I was starved for connection after weeks on the lonesome trail. Leaving home had carved a hole in me bigger than the Grand Canyon, which I hadn't seen yet, but you get the drift. Loneliness gnawed at my guts like a rabid coon, and here was this ethereal beauty, off-airing a spark in the dark. She died in 1832, heart shattered when her fiancé lit out west for fortune, leaving her to wither away in some dusty attic room. Sound familiar? Kinda like those ghostin' dudes on Tinder today. Promised the world, then poof, vanished into the digital ether, leaving you scrolling through old pics at 2 a.m. Y'all, I fell harder than a sack of potatoes off a wagon. We'd meet under those ancient oaks, sharing stories till dawn threatened. I'd spin yarns about Boston's smoky streets, the roar of factory machines that almost swallowed my paw whole. She'd recount her life, dances in grand halls, stolen kisses under harvest moons, her words painting pictures in the air, vivid as a daguerreotype. Her touch, icy as a winter pond, sending electric shivers racing down my spine. But it warmed the frozen parts of my soul, making me feel alive in ways I hadn't since childhood. She held all the cards, manipulating the shadows like a puppet master. One night, she'd wave a hand, and visions flickered her wedding day that never came, her lover's horse galloping away into the sunset. It was psychological warfare, pulling me in deeper, like a toxic ex who breadcrumbs you with late-night texts. Miss you, but stay away. I was hooked, questioning my sanity, wondering if this was love or madness. 'Cause researching these old haunts, yeah, I dug into the archives later in life, folks. Union Cemetery ain't just any boneyard. It's ground zero for the infamous White Lady, a specter that's been scaring the bejesus out of folks for centuries. Legends say she's a composite of tragedies. Maybe Harriet R. Seeley, buried there in 1853 after dying young, or some poor soul from the 1940s murdered in a fit of passion. Others whisper she searches for a lost child, wailing along Route 59, appearing to drivers who swear they've hit her, only to find nothing but mist. Ed and Lorraine Warren, those ghost-hunting pros from later years, called it one of the most haunted spots in America, riddled with demonic vibes. In my tale, Annabelle was her, or a piece of her, a White Lady variant. Her gown stained with the blood of betrayal, her presence tied to those 19th century graves of women snuffed out too soon. Horror amps up slow at first, buildin' like a storm on the horizon. Our dates started innocent, laughter echoing, mine hearty, hers hollow. But then the signs crept in, phantom lights dancin' between tombs, will-o'-the-wisps. They call 'em Leodin fools to doom. One evenin', as we sat, a chill wind whipped up, carryin' moans from the earth. "They're jealous," she cooed, her eyes glintin' like polished obsidian. Then, the real terror, she led me to her grave, a cracked slab readin', Annabel Hawthorne, 1810 to 1832, beloved daughter, forsaken bride. Dirt shifted underfoot, like the ground was breathin'. Skeletal hands, rotten flesh hangin' in strips. Nails like claws burst through the soil, grippin' at my ankles. "Join me, Elias," she moaned, her face twistin' into something feral, teeth bared in a grin that stretched too wide. Her laugh, a cackle that pierced the night, echoing off the stones, chillin' my blood to ice. I bolted, heart poundin' like a war drum, lantern swingin' wild, shadows lungin' like livin' things. But wait, 'cause she wasn't done. Nights later, I returned. Stupid? Yeah, but love makes you dumb. She revealed more. Her fiancé didn't just leave. He was cursed, drawn west by dark forces, and now she needed my help to break the chain. Was it a trap? A plea? Suddenly, I held the key, a locket from her grave, inscribed with ancient runes, pulled from old Puritan lore. Folks, these cemeteries were built on witch trial vibes. The metallic tang of fear in my mouth, her perfume tannin sour like decay. Fog so thick I tasted it on my tongue. This was Tinder gone spectral, swipin' right on a profile from the 1800s, only to find out it's a catfish from the crypt. Dude, I thought I was smooth, whisperin' sweet nothings to a ghost. Next level desperate, like matchin' with a bot that drains your soul instead of your wallet. Or worse, ghosted literally. But the laughs fade when the horror hits. Imagine your ex hauntin' your dreams. But for real, manipulatin' reality till you're questionin' what's flesh and what's phantom. And just when I thought I'd escape, other spirits stirred. Child ghosts playin' hide and seek in the mist, their giggles tunnin' to guttural growls. A hooded figure, maybe a long-dead minister watchin' from afar, Bible in hand, eyes glowin' red. Annabel's pull grew stronger, visions showin' my own future. Buried alive if I stayed, damned if I fled. Stakes skyrocketed, my adventure tunnin' into a quest for my soul. So there I was, boots poundin' the gravel path, lantern swingin' wild as skeletal fingers clawed at the dirt behind me. Annabel's cackle echoed through the fog, bouncing off crooked graves like a bad echo in a canyon. "Join me, Elias, forever." "Nah, no thanks, lady." I bolted east, toward the Connecticut coast, legs burnin', lungs screamin', sensory hell. The damp earth smell turned sour with fear sweat, branches whippin' my face like icy whips, and that blood moon glarin' down like a judgmental eye. I didn't stop till dawn broke over New Haven Harbor, ships bobbin' like corks in the choppy Atlantic. Stakes? My soul on the line stay, and I'd be ghost chow. Flee and dive into the unknown. Emotional core. Heartbroken, yeah, but that icy touch lingered, yanking me back even as I ran. She manipulated the shadows, but now I was taking control. Or so I thought. Why east, you'll ask? Panic, pure and simple. West meant more wilderness horrors. East, the sea, promise of escape. Researching later, diving into old logs and tales. The 1840s were the dawn of steamship fever. Cunard lines running bi-weekly from Boston to Liverpool, crossing the Atlantic in about 10 to 14 days instead of the old sailing months. Folks were fleeing famines or chasing dreams. But me, I was dodging the dead. No cash for a ticket. I was broker than a busted slot machine. So I stowed away on the SS Britannia, a Cunard paddle-wheeler bound for England. Slipped aboard at dusk, hiding in the cargo hold amid crates of Yankee cotton and rum barrels. Me, a landlubber hiding like a rat in a cheese factory. Like sneak in onto a budget flight to Europe, praying no one checks the overhead bins. But instead of peanuts, I got seasickness and spirits. The voyage, pure nightmare fuel, amped up with Atlantic folklore that'd make your hair stand on end. As we shoved off, waves crashing against the hull like thunderclaps. I hunkered down in the dark hole reeking of salt, tar, and mildew that stuck to you like glue. First night out, whispers started. Not the crew's rough accents, but ethereal moans rising from the depths. Turns out, the Atlantic's riddled with ghost ship tales, the Flying Dutchman. That cursed vessel doomed to sail forever, glowing eerie and spelling doom for any who spot it. Sailors swore they'd seen her silhouette on stormy horizons, a phantom omen from 17th century lore. But in my 1845 hell, she felt real. Visions hit. Annabelle's face in the porthole mist, her pale hand waving from the waves. The sea held the reins now, toying with my mind like a cat with a mouse. A gale howled like banshees, ship pitching wild. I crept topside for air, salt spray stinging my eyes, wind tearing at my coat. There, in the lightning flashes, a spectral ship paralleling us, sails tattered, crew of skeletons manning the decks. The ship that saw a ghost, old yarns called similar tales, where vessels encounter phantoms and lose their souls. One night, a figure boarded translucent, in a tricorn hat, whispering curses from yellow jack plagues or lost souls like the Mary Celeste. Though that wreck was later, the vibes were timeless. I fought back hallucinations, clutching that locket from her grave, chanting prayers like a madman. Was this her revenge, chasing me across the ocean? Or my guilt manifesting, like a bad breakup where your ex hacks your socials, haunting every feed, but with real waves trying to drown ya? Finally, after 12 days of terror, steam power cut the old sail times in half, thank the stars. We docked in Liverpool, that bustling English port, fog thicker than pea soup, smelling of coal smoke and fish markets. I slipped off unseen, legs wobbly as a newborn colt, heart still racing. But England ain't the safe haven I hoped. Wandering the cobbled streets, gas lamps flickering like wary eyes, I stumbled south to Gloucestershire, drawn by whispers from fellow travelers about the ancient ram inn, a 12th century pile claiming to be England's most haunted spot, built on pagan grounds with a history of witches, murders, and incubi. Why there? Annabelle's visions hinted her fiancé didn't go west. He fled to England, cursed by the same dark forces. Now I was the hunter, but the inn's shadows had other ideas. The inn's creaky beams groaned like old bones, air heavy with incense and decay, walls whispering secrets from 800 years of hell. First night, a succubus ghost pinned me down, breath hot as brimstone, while child spirits giggled in the corners. Annabelle appeared again, crossin' oceans like it was nothin', her form twistin' with English folklore, maybe tied to the white lady legends echoing from Union to here. My adventure morphed into a transatlantic curse chase. From Yankee graveyards to Brit pubs, I was the original haunted tourist. Like booking an Airbnb that's cozy with vibes. But the vibes are demonic. Swipe left on that Vaki. Tied to 19th century emigration waves, millions sailed from Liverpool. But me? Going the wrong way, chasing ghosts amid the Industrial Revolution's smoke. Loneliness drove me, but now it was obsession. Break the curse or join the ethereal club. Then, bam, I woke up, sprawled in a horse cart, hay pricklin' my neck, world jouncing like a bad TikTok dance. No clue how I got there. 1 minute, dodging phantoms in Gloucestershire. The next, rattling toward Bury Street, Edmonds, a medieval Suffolk town steeped in ghost stories. The driver, a grizzled coot with a face like crumpled leather, muttered, "Bury Street, Edmonds, straight ahead," flicking his reins. The cart creaked, horses snorted steam, air thick with manure and damp earth. My hands clutched Annabelle's locket, now warm as a coal. Bury's history screamed occult street Edmondsbury Cathedral, abbey ruins with monk spirits, witch trials from the 1600s. The sky darkened, shadows moved in hedgerows humanoid, eyes like embers. The driver hummed hymns, oblivious, but Annabelle's voice whispered, "Lost soul. He's hers." Was I cursed or losing it? The locket burned, runes glowing red, gooeyed in me like a cursed GPS modern twist. Like waking up after a wild night, Uber history saying you went somewhere weird, but it's 1845, and weird is a haunted town with your ghost ex stalking ya. Waking up in a hay cart like I partied too hard at a Renaissance fair. Modern day, passing out at Coachella, waking in an RV to Vegas, no wallet. Only my driver's humming hymns, and I'm praying he ain't delivering me to Satan's doorstep. Horror spikes. At Barry's Angel Hill, where gallows once stood, the driver turned, eyes milky white, raspin, she's waitin'. Annabelle's silhouette flickered in the cathedral's shadow, joined by noosed monks and a grey lady sobbing blood. My soul was on the line, love and terror tangled, her curse now tied to England's haunted heart. The first whispers reached me in a dingy tavern in Bury Street, Edmonds. Some drunk farmer kept mumbling about his neighbor's daughter, Maria something, who'd vanished. But here's the kicker. She didn't just disappear like your Tinder matches. She vanished after meeting her lover at a red-tiled barn. And let me tell you, in 1800s, that was basically the Victorian equivalent of going to a secondary location. You know, the thing every true crime podcast tells you to never do. Maria Martin wasn't your typical Victorian wallflower. This girl had range. Born in Suffolk in 1801, she was what we'd call today a complicated queen. She'd already had kids with different dudes, which in Victorian times was like having face tattoos. It marked you for life. But Maria? She didn't give a damn about society's judgment. She was living her truth before living your truth was even a thing. And that's exactly what made her a target for William Corder, a guy who was basically the 1800s version of a manipulative fuckboy. William Corder was a troublemaker. The son of a wealthy farmer, the sly lady's man, who went by the nickname Foxy, was known to forge checks and steal animals from neighboring farms. This dude was literally catfishing before the internet existed. He'd forge love letters, steal pigs, yeah. Pig theft was apparently his side hustle, and sweet-talk his way into women's hearts just to destroy their lives. Now imagine me, this clueless 19-year-old, hearing about this mystery and thinking, oh cool, a missing person case. This'll be fun. Spoiler alert, it wasn't fun. It was the opposite of fun. It was unfun? Is that a word? It should be. May 18th, the date that changed everything. While I'm out here wandering like some budget Jack Kerouac, Maria Martin walks into a red-tiled barn in Polstead, Suffolk, to meet her boyfriend. Sounds romantic, right? Wrong. So very catastrophically wrong. This barn wasn't some cute rustic Instagram backdrop. This thing was straight out of a horror movie. Isolated, creaky, surrounded by fields where you could scream and nobody would hear you. It was basically the perfect murder scene, which should have been Maria's first red flag. But love makes you do stupid things, and Maria was apparently running a whole parade of red flags. Here's what went down, based on what I pieced together from local gossip, court records, and way too many sleepless nights. Corder convinced Maria to meet him at the barn, telling her they'd finally elope. He even had her dress up like a man for the journey. You know, for safety. The manipulation game was strong with this one. But Corder? He never planned on marrying anybody. On May 18th, the son of a respectable farmer, William Corder, murdered his lover Maria Martin in the Red Barn. Shot her dead and buried her right there in the barn floor. Just like that. 1 minute she's planning her future, the next well, she doesn't have a future anymore. And me? I'm completely oblivious, wandering around the countryside like some Victorian-era true crime podcaster. Except instead of a microphone, I had whatever rumors drunk farmers would share for the price of an ale. Now here's where Corder really shows his sociopathic colors. This dude didn't just kill Maria and panic. Oh no, he had a plan. He starts writing fake letters to her family, pretending to be Maria, saying she's living it up on the Isle of Wight with her new husband. We're talking full catfish mode, people. Imagine getting texts from your missing friends saying, OMG, so happy. Married life is amazing. Don't worry about me. Except it's actually from their killer. That's some next-level psychological warfare right there. Meanwhile, I'm hearing bits and pieces of this story as I drift from town to town, and honestly, I'm eating this drama up. I was like a Victorian TMZ reporter, except with worse hygiene and zero fact-checking abilities. I thought this was just juicy gossip. I had no idea I was witnessing the birth of modern murder entertainment. April 19th, almost a full year after Maria disappeared. While Corder's out there living his best life, thinking he's gotten away with murder, Maria's stepmother and Martin starts having these absolutely wild dreams. Mrs. Martin was having a bad dream. A ghostly figure appeared to her, pointing to a spot on the ground. The ghost was her missing stepdaughter, and she kept pointing to the same place, the Red Barn. Now, I know what you're thinking. Yeah, right, convenient ghost dreams. But hear me out. This woman had the exact same dream multiple times. And in 1800s, people didn't mess around with recurring nightmares. They figured the universe was trying to tell them something. So Thomas Martin, Maria's father, decides to check out the barn. And let me tell you, when this man started digging in that barn floor, he wasn't expecting to solve a murder case. He was probably thinking, this is going to shut my wife up about her weird dreams. Instead, he found his daughter's decomposed body, still wearing the clothes she'd left home in almost a year earlier. The smell alone must have been... Actually, let's not go there. But the horror on that man's face when he realized his worst fears were true, that's the kind of trauma that echoes through generations. Now we get to see 1800s version of a criminal investigation, which was basically find the most obvious suspect and hope for the best. Lucky for justice, Corder was about as subtle as a brick through a window. The authorities tracked him down to some boarding house where he was living under a fake name with a new wife. Yeah, this dude got married while his victim was rotting in a barn. The audacity was truly unmatched. It's like if a modern serial killer started a family blog while hiding bodies in his basement. But here's where it gets really dark, and I mean really dark. When they arrested Corder, they found love letters he'd written to other women. This wasn't a crime of passion. This was a pattern. Maria wasn't his first victim. She was just the one who got caught. Literally. The plays of the Victorian era tended to portray Corder as a cold-blooded monster and Martin as the innocent whom he preyed upon, and honestly, they weren't wrong. This dude was running a whole operation of manipulation and murder. The trial was basically the O.J. Simpson case of 1800s. Everyone was talking about it. People traveled for miles just to catch a glimpse of Corder. The media coverage was insane. Newspapers, pamphlets, ballads, you name it. They turned this tragedy into entertainment faster than you can say, true crime podcast. And me? I'm right there in the thick of it, watching this circus unfold. I saw how people's eyes would light up when they talked about the murder. It was horrifying and fascinating at the same time. Like watching a car crash in slow motion, except the car crash was society's relationship with violence and death. Corder's execution on August 11th drew crowds that would make Taylor Swift jealous. We're talking thousands of people showing up to watch a man die. They were selling programs like it was a concert. Come see William Corder get hanged. Popcorn and peanuts. Except, with more public urination and less hygiene. But here's where things get really messed up. After Corder's execution, people started treating his body like a souvenir factory. Cases like Corder's contributed to a collective desire to own physical mementos from famous murder scenes, now called murderabilia. They made books bound in his skin. Let me repeat that. Books bound in human skin. We're talking about people so obsessed with this murder case that they literally wanted to own pieces of the murderer. It's like if people today were making iPhone cases out of serial killer skin. Absolutely unhinged. And that red barn? Stripped bare by souvenir hunters. People took pieces of wood home like they were collecting concert memorabilia. Imagine explaining to your Victorian-era friends, "Oh, this? Just a piece of wood from where Maria got murdered. Goes great with my tea set. I watched all this happen and honestly, changed me. I realized I wasn't just wandering around for adventure anymore. I was witnessing something profound about human nature, our weird, twisted relationship with violence and death. We're attracted to it, repulsed by it, and somehow entertained by it all at the same time." So there I was, traumatized by the whole Maria Martin situation, thinking maybe I needed a change of scenery. Edinburgh seemed like a good idea. Intellectual city, medical schools, surely more civilized than the countryside murder barns I'd been hanging around. Wrong. So very catastrophically wrong. Again. Apparently, I had a talent for stumbling into the worst possible situations at the worst possible times. If there was a murder happening somewhere in Britain, you could bet your ass I'd wander right into it. November. I'm barely settled into Edinburgh's old town which, by the way, smelled like a combination of sewage, whiskey, and broken dreams, when I start hearing whispers about people disappearing. Not mysterious disappearances like Maria. These were different, deliberate, calculated, businesslike. Meet Burke and Hare, the original entrepreneurs of death. Enter William Burke and William Hare, two Irish immigrants who figured out how to monetize murder before capitalism even knew what it was. William Burke and William Hare, who sold the corpses to Robert Knox for dissection at his anatomy lectures. These guys weren't your typical serial killers. They weren't killing for pleasure or revenge. They were killing for money. Cold, hard cash. They turned murder into a business model, which is somehow both more and less terrifying than killing for emotional reasons. See, Edinburgh was the Silicon Valley of medical education in the 1820s. Everyone wanted to study anatomy, but there weren't enough legal corpses to go around. Scottish law required that corpses used for medical research should only come from those who had died in prison, suicide victims, or from foundlings and orphans. So there was this massive supply-demand problem in the corpse market. And Burke and Hare? They spotted this gap in the market and thought, you know what? Let's create our own supply chain. Except their supply chain involved suffocating innocent people and selling their bodies to Dr. Robert Knox, who asked zero questions as long as the corpses were fresh. William Burke and William Hare terrorized the cobblestone streets of Scotland's capital, kidnapping and murdering 16 people for medical experimentation. 16 people. That's not a crime of passion. That's a serial business operation. Their method was terrifyingly efficient. They'd target the vulnerable, elderly, disabled, sex workers, anyone society wouldn't immediately miss. They'd get them drunk, invite them back to their lodging house, and then, well, they called it burking, suffocating someone so there weren't any obvious signs of violence that would make the corpse less valuable. And the scariest part? I was living maybe half a mile from where this was all happening. I'd walk past their lodging house on Westport Street, completely oblivious that there were literally bodies being processed inside like some kind of human slaughterhouse. Dr. Robert Knox was paying them between £7 to £10 per body, which doesn't sound like much until you realize that was about 3 months' wages for a working person. These guys were making bank on murder. They were the Victorian equivalent of a successful startup, except instead of disrupting transportation or food delivery, they were disrupting life permanently. Let me tell you about some of their victims because they weren't just numbers. They were real people with real lives that got cut short for profit. There was Mary Patterson, an 18-year-old sex worker who was apparently so beautiful that when Burke and Hare delivered her body, the medical students recognized her from around town. Think about that, she was so well known, so alive in people's memories, that seeing her corpse on a dissection table immediately raised red flags. Then there was James Wilson, known as Daft Jamie, a disabled young man who was beloved in the local community. When he disappeared, people noticed. When his body showed up on Knox's table, students who knew him were horrified. It was like if your neighborhood's friendly guy suddenly appeared as a cadaver in your anatomy class. And here's the thing that really gets me. I probably saw some of these people alive. I might have bought bread from the same baker as Mary Patterson, or shared a drink at the same tavern as Daft Jamie. These weren't strangers from another world. They were my neighbors, and I had no idea they were being hunted. The whole operation started falling apart on Halloween night 1828. Because of course it was Halloween. Burke and Hare had killed an old Irish woman named Marjorie Campbell. But this time, they got sloppy. Some other tenants in the lodging house found the body before Burke and Hare could deliver it to Dr. Knox. The game was up. When the authorities showed up, Hare immediately threw Burke under the bus in exchange for immunity. Honor among thieves? More like honor among corpse dealers, which is to say, absolutely none. The trial was even more sensational than Quarters. Burke got hanged on January 28, 1829, in front of a crowd of 25,000 people. 25,000. That's more people than attend most professional sporting events today. They were literally selling seats with better views of the execution. And in the ultimate irony, after Burke was executed, his body was publicly dissected at Edinburgh Medical College, the same place where many of his victims had ended up. Talk about poetic justice. They even made a pocketbook out of his skin, because apparently Victorians had zero chill when it came to death-related crafts. I was there for Burke's execution, standing in that crowd of 25,000 bloodthirsty spectators, watching a man die for crimes that happened literally down the street from where I was living. The atmosphere was like a festival. People were eating, drinking, cheering. It was absolutely surreal. But here's what really messed with my head. I realized that I was part of it now. I wasn't just an observer anymore. I was complicit in this whole twisted entertainment system. I was there, watching, participating in the spectacle of death just like everyone else. That night, after Burke was hanged and the crowds went home, I walked through Edinburgh's Old Town alone. The same streets where Burke and Hare had hunted their victims were now quiet and empty. I kept imagining the last moments of people like Mary Patterson and Daft Jamie, how they must have felt when they realized what was happening. And I kept thinking about Maria Martin too, alone in that red barn with William Corder. How many last moments like that had I unknowingly walked past in my wanderings? How much horror was hiding behind ordinary doors and windows? So there I was, 20 years old, having witnessed two of the most infamous murder cases in British history. Most people my age were worried about finding jobs or getting married. I was dealing with existential trauma from watching society's relationship with violence and death play out in real time. But here's the thing I realized. What I witnessed in 1827 to 1828 was the birth of modern true crime culture. The Red Barn murder and the Burke and Hare case weren't just isolated incidents. They were the beginning of our collective obsession with murder as entertainment. Think about it. The Maria Martin case had everything we love in true crime today. A manipulative male killer, a vulnerable female victim, family drama, a supernatural twist with the stepmother's dreams, a dramatic trial, and even merchandising afterwards. Sound familiar? It's literally the template for every true crime podcast, Netflix documentary, and TikTok series you've ever watched. And Burke and Hare? They were running a murder business that would make modern serial killers jealous. Systematic, efficient, profit-driven. They turned killing into a side hustle before side hustles were even a thing. After these cases, murder became mainstream entertainment. There's something about the Victorian-era setting, the rather jovial, gallows humor attitude of Burke and Hare, and the ghastly circumstances that have kept people engaged all these years. They started making plays about Maria Martin's murder, like actual theatrical productions where actors reenacted her death for paying audiences. It was like dinner theater, but with more murder and less dinner. People would dress up for date nights to watch someone get fake murdered on stage. Books, ballads, penny dreadfuls, souvenir pieces of the murder barn. They turned tragedy into a whole entertainment industry. It was the Victorian equivalent of true crime merchandise, except instead of podcast t-shirts, you could buy actual pieces of the murder weapon. And here's what really blew my mind. People were more interested in the killers than the victims. William Corder became this romantic anti-hero figure. Burke and Hare were portrayed as cheeky rogues instead of cold-blooded murderers. Sound familiar? It's the same way we romanticize serial killers today. Fast forward to 2025, and honestly, nothing's changed. We just have better technology now. Instead of crowding around execution platforms, we binge-watch Netflix documentaries about serial killers. Instead of buying pieces of murder barns, we buy true crime podcasts merchandise. Instead of attending theatrical reenactments, we watch Lifetime movies based on real murders. We're still turning other people's trauma into our entertainment. We're still more fascinated by killers than victims. We're still showing up in massive numbers to consume content about death and violence. Think about it. Ted Bundy documentaries get millions of views. Serial killer TikToks go viral. True crime podcasts dominate the charts. We have whole communities of people who study murder cases for fun. Some people even write fanfiction about real serial killers. Fanfiction about real murderers. The only difference between 1828 and 2025 is that instead of 25,000 people showing up to watch an execution, we have 25 million people streaming a documentary about the executioner. But why? Why are we so fascinated by murder and death? I've had almost 200 years to think about this, and I think I've figured it out. First, there's the safety factor. We can experience the thrill of danger from the comfort of our couches. It's like a psychological horror movie where you know you're safe but still get the adrenaline rush. Second, there's the puzzle aspect. We want to understand the why behind incomprehensible acts. How does someone decide to kill another person? What makes a William Corder or a Burke and Hare? We're trying to solve the unsolvable mystery of human evil. Third, and this is the dark one, I think we're all capable of violence under the right circumstances, and consuming true crime content lets us explore that side of ourselves without consequences. We can imagine what it would be like to be the killer or the victim or the detective, all from the safety of fiction. But here's what bothers me. In our fascination with the killers, we forget about the victims. Maria Martin becomes just a plot device in William Corder's story. Mary Patterson becomes just a number in Burke and Hare's body count. Real people become supporting characters in their own murders. Maria Martin wasn't just a naive victim. She was a young woman trying to survive in a world that offered her few options. She'd already had children, already faced society's judgment, and she was still fighting to build a life for herself. She deserved better than to become a cautionary tale about meeting strange men in barns. Mary Patterson wasn't just a pretty corpse that shocked medical students. She was an 18-year-old trying to make a living in a society that criminalized her profession and then acted shocked when she became a victim of violence. Daft Jamie wasn't just a disabled man who made an easy target. He was a beloved community member who brought joy to people's lives. His murder wasn't just a tragedy. It was a loss that rippled through an entire neighborhood. These people had hopes, dreams, fears, relationships. They had favorite foods and songs they hummed and people they loved. They weren't just plot points in someone else's story. They were the story. And we owe it to them to remember that. So here I am, almost 200 years later, still wandering, still observing, still trying to make sense of humanity's relationship with death and violence. I've watched us go from public executions to private streaming, from penny dreadfuls to podcasts, from souvenir hunting to online merch stores. The technology changes, but we don't. We're still the same species that crowded around gallows and stripped murder barns for souvenirs. We're still turning tragedy into entertainment, killers into celebrities, and victims into footnotes. But maybe that's okay. Maybe our fascination with death is just part of being human. Maybe consuming true crime content is how we process our own mortality and the random violence that could touch any of us at any time. Just remember, behind every true crime case is real trauma, real loss, real families who are still dealing with the aftermath. When you're binge-watching that serial killer documentary or listening to that murder podcast, you're consuming someone else's worst day. It's funny how trauma ages you. I was still technically a young man, but I felt like I'd lived through a war. Which, in a way, I had a war between civilization and savagery, and I'd been standing right on the battlefield, taking notes like some deranged war correspondent. I started thinking about my old life, that boring existence I'd run away from. My father's expectations, my mother's worried looks, the predictable future they'd mapped out for me. Suddenly, predictable didn't sound so bad. Boring sounded like paradise compared to stumbling into murder scenes every 6 months. I decided to try something radical, being a normal person. I know, after everything I'd been through, normal was probably off the table forever. But I had to try, right? I couldn't spend the rest of my life as a professional witness to humanity's worst impulses. So I started looking for a place to settle down. Somewhere quiet, where the biggest drama would be Mrs. Henderson arguing with the baker about bread prices. Not corpses being dug up from barn floors. First stop, Bath. Seemed perfect, right? Fancy spa town, wealthy people, lots of culture. What could go wrong? Well, turns out wealthy people have their own special brand of crazy. Within a week, I'd heard rumors about a local lord who'd allegedly murdered his wife and fed her to his hunting dogs. I noped out of there faster than you can say, true crime podcast material. Next try, Canterbury. Religious town, cathedral, surely the presence of God would keep the murder rate down? Wrong again. Apparently, religious communities just hide their crazy better. I lasted 2 weeks before overhearing a conversation about a monk who'd been accidentally poisoned during communion. At this point, I was starting to think I was cursed. After the 4th town where I somehow stumbled into whispers of suspicious deaths, I had a horrible realization. Maybe it wasn't that these places were particularly murdery. Maybe I'd developed some kind of supernatural radar for death and violence. like a really disturbing superpower that absolutely nobody asked for. Think about it. What are the odds of one person accidentally encountering multiple famous murder cases? It's like winning the world's worst lottery multiple times in a row. Either I was the unluckiest bastard in Britain, or there was something about me that attracted these situations. I started paying attention to my instincts. You know how some people can smell rain coming? I could apparently smell impending doom. I'd walk into a tavern, and something in my gut would say, someone's gonna die here. And sure enough, 3 days later, there'd be a body in the river. It was both a blessing and a curse. On one hand, I could avoid dangerous situations. On the other hand, I was basically living in a constant state of low-level anxiety because my murder radar was always pinging. Do you know how exhausting it is to be perpetually aware of humanity's capacity for violence? After wallowing in self-pity for a few months, and yes, I had a whole emo phase before emo was even invented, I decided to try using my weird death sense for good. If I could predict where bad things were going to happen, maybe I could prevent them. That went about as well as you'd expect. I'm in some small Yorkshire town, getting major murder vibes from this one particular house. So I do what any reasonable person would do. I start hanging around, trying to figure out what's going on. Except, reasonable person behavior apparently doesn't include lurking outside people's homes for days on end. Long story short, the locals decided I was either a burglar or a lunatic, and I ended up spending 3 days in the town jail before they realized I was just weirdly concerned about their safety. The magistrate literally said, "Son, being creepy isn't a crime, but if you keep this up, we'll make it one." Meanwhile, the murder I was trying to prevent totally happened anyway. Husband poisoned his wife with arsenic in her tea, just like my gut said he would. But did anyone thank me for my attempted intervention? Of course not. I just looked like a crazy person who'd coincidentally predicted a crime. By 1830, I was having what you'd probably call a quarter-life crisis. Except instead of buying an expensive car or getting a terrible tattoo, I was questioning whether I was destined to spend my entire life surrounded by death and violence. I started keeping a journal. Yeah, I know, very millennial of me, trying to process everything I'd seen and experienced. Turns out, writing about trauma is therapeutic, even if your trauma involves witnessing some of the most famous murders in British history. Reading back through those entries now, I can see how much I'd changed. The eager, naive kid who'd left home looking for adventure was gone. In his place was someone who understood that the world was a fundamentally dangerous place, but who still wanted to find some corner of it where he could build something good. I wasn't the same person who'd heard about Maria Martin's disappearance and thought, "Ooh, mystery." Now I heard about missing people and my first thought was, someone's family is about to get their heart broken. That's growth, I guess. Depressing, trauma-induced growth, but growth nonetheless. The breakthrough came in 1831, in a little town called Lewes in Sussex. I'd been there for about a month, keeping my head down, working as a clerk for a local solicitor. Because apparently witnessing multiple murder trials gives you transferable skills in legal documentation. One evening, I'm at the local pub trying to blend in and be normal, when this group of guys starts talking about the Burke and Hare case. But instead of the usual, "Ooh, how scary" gossip, they were having an actual intellectual discussion about the social implications of the murders. These weren't ghoulish entertainment seekers. These were genuinely thoughtful people trying to understand how society had failed so badly that 16 people could be murdered for profit without anyone noticing until it was almost too late. I found myself joining the conversation, and for the first time in years, I could talk about what I'd witnessed without feeling like either a freak or a tourist in other people's tragedy. These people got it. They understood that there was something important to learn from these horrible events. Turns out they were part of this informal group of social reformers, writers, and thinkers who met regularly to discuss the big issues of the day. Prison reform, workers' rights, medical ethics. All the stuff that the Burke and Hare case had brought into sharp focus. For the first time since I'd left home, I felt like I'd found my tribe. People who understood that you could be fascinated by crime and violence without being entertained by it. Who saw these cases as symptoms of larger social problems that needed solving, not just juicy stories to gossip about. I started attending their meetings regularly, and slowly, I began to feel like maybe I could build a life that made sense. Maybe all the horrible stuff I'd witnessed could actually serve a purpose beyond just giving me nightmares and an unhealthy cynicism about human nature. I rented a small cottage on the outskirts of Lewis, nothing fancy, but it was mine. After years of wandering from inn to inn, having my own space felt like the ultimate luxury. I could arrange my books however I wanted, eat meals at whatever time I chose, and most importantly, I could control who had access to my living space. You'd be amazed how much having your own front door changes your perspective on life. Suddenly, instead of always being ready to leave at a moment's notice, I was thinking about things like which flowers to plant in my garden and whether I needed better curtains for winter. My new friends encouraged me to write about my experiences. You've seen things that most people only read about in newspapers, they said. You have a unique perspective on these social issues. So I started working on what would eventually become a series of pamphlets about crime, punishment, and social reform. Writing turned out to be surprisingly therapeutic. Instead of just carrying all these horrible memories around like stones in my stomach, I could transform them into something useful. Maybe other people could learn from what I'd witnessed without having to live through it themselves. My first pamphlet was called Letters from a Witness: What the Red Barn Murder Teaches Us About the Treatment of Women in Rural Society. Not exactly a catchy title, but it got people talking. I analyzed how Maria Martin's previous relationships and illegitimate children made her vulnerable to manipulation, and how society's treatment of fallen women basically painted targets on their backs for predators like William Corder. The second one was about Burke and Hare, the economics of murder, how poverty and desperation created Scotland's body-snatching trade. I argued that the real criminals weren't just the murderers, but the social systems that made murder profitable and turned a blind eye to suspicious deaths among the poor and vulnerable. Turns out there was actually a market for thoughtful analysis of crime and social issues. Who knew? My pamphlets started selling well, not just locally but throughout England. People were hungry for something more substantial than the sensationalized penny dreadfuls and ballads that usually followed famous crimes. Publishers started approaching me with offers. Could you write a full book about your experiences? Would you consider a series on famous crimes of the past decade? Suddenly, the weird life I'd stumbled into accidentally was becoming an actual career. I'll be honest, it felt surreal. I'd spent years thinking I was cursed to witness horrible things, and now people were paying me to write about those horrible things. It was like turning my trauma into my trade, which sounds either really healthy or really unhealthy depending on how you look at it. But hey, at least I was finally making money from all that suffering I'd witnessed. Better late than never, right? And unlike Burke and Hare, my business model didn't involve actually creating more corpses, so I figured I was already ahead of the ethical curve. Around 1833, I met Eleanor. She was a teacher at the local girls' school, and she attended our social reform meetings because she was passionate about education reform. Smart, funny, and, most importantly, not the least bit squeamish about my unusual background. Our first real conversation was about the social conditions that led to the Burke and Hare murders. I know, not exactly typical romantic small talk. But there's something incredibly attractive about someone who can discuss the intersection of poverty, medical ethics, and serial murder over tea and biscuits without batting an eye. Most women of that era would have been horrified by my stories, or at least would have pretended to be. Eleanor just asked really good questions. Do you think better regulation of medical schools could have prevented the murders? What role did religious attitudes toward dissection play in creating the black market for corpses? Smart, thoughtful questions that showed she actually understood the issues. I remember the moment I knew I was in love with her. We were discussing one of my pamphlets, and she pointed out a flaw in my argument that I'd completely missed. Instead of being defensive, I was just impressed. Here was someone who could make my work better, who could see angles I'd missed, who treated my weird expertise as valuable rather than disturbing. I decided to propose to Eleanor in the spring of 1834. I'd been planning this elaborate romantic gesture. Picnic in the countryside, sunset, the whole 9 yards. But of course, nothing in my life could ever be simple. So there we are, having this lovely picnic in what I thought was a perfectly innocent meadow, when Eleanor suddenly goes very quiet. Is it just me, she says, or does this place feel wrong somehow? And sure enough, my murder radar was going absolutely haywire. Turns out, we'd accidentally chosen to have our romantic picnic about 50 yards from where a local farmer had buried his wife after beating her to death the previous winter. The case hadn't even been discovered yet. The body wouldn't be found for another 3 months. But somehow both Eleanor and I could sense that something terrible had happened there. So there I am, trying to propose marriage while simultaneously getting the creeps from an undiscovered murder scene. Most people would consider this a bad omen, but Eleanor just looked at me and said, "Well, at least we know we're compatible. We both have terrible luck with romantic locations." That's when I knew she was the one. Anyone who could find humor in that situation, who could accept that dating me meant occasionally stumbling into crime scenes during what should have been normal activities. That was a keeper. We got married in the fall of 1834, and I finally understood what people meant when they talked about finding their other half. Eleanor didn't just tolerate my strange life. She made it better. She helped me research my writing. She offered insights I never would have thought of, and most importantly, she helped me see that my experiences could be a source of hope, not just horror. Our house became a gathering place for like-minded people. Writers, reformers, lawyers, doctors, all sorts of people who were working to make society better in their own ways. We'd have dinner parties where the conversation might jump from prison reform to medical ethics to women's rights, all informed by real-world examples of what happens when these systems fail. It was everything I'd never known I wanted. A home, a partner, meaningful work, and a community of people who cared about the same things I did. I'd finally found a way to build something positive from all the darkness I'd witnessed. Of course, my murder radar didn't just disappear. If anything, it got stronger over the years. But now, instead of it being this isolated burden that made me feel like a freak, it was something Eleanor and I could navigate together. She learned to trust my instincts, and I learned to trust her judgment about when and how to act on them. In 1836, Eleanor and I had our first child, a daughter we named Catherine, after Catherine of Aragon, because Eleanor had strong opinions about women who'd been unfairly treated by history. From the moment Kathy was born, I was determined that she would grow up in a world that was safer and more just than the one I'd wandered through. Having a child changes your perspective on everything, but especially on violence and crime. Suddenly, every story of a murdered woman hit differently because I could imagine someone hurting my daughter. Every account of vulnerable people being preyed upon made me more determined to be part of the solution. Eleanor and I started incorporating social justice work more directly into our daily lives. We supported organizations that helped women in difficult situations, funded education programs for poor children, advocated for medical reform. All the things that might have prevented the tragedies we'd studied and written about. And as Kathy got older, we taught her about the realities of the world without traumatizing her. We wanted her to be aware and cautious without being afraid, to understand that evil existed but that good people working together could fight it. In 1838, 11 years after I'd first heard about Maria Martin's disappearance, I got a letter from a young journalist who was writing a retrospective piece on the Red Barn murder. He'd heard about my pamphlets and wanted to interview me about my unique perspective on the case. Sitting in my study, looking out at the garden Eleanor and I had planted together, telling this young man about that scared, lost kid who'd heard tavern gossip and thought he'd stumbled onto an adventure. It felt like talking about a different person entirely. I realized that the boy who'd left home looking for mystery and excitement had found exactly what he was looking for, just not in the way he'd expected. The mystery wasn't who committed these crimes. It was, how do we build a society where such crimes are less likely to happen? The excitement wasn't in witnessing violence. It was in being part of the solution. That scared, lonely kid who thought he wanted to live on the margins of society had ended up right in the middle of it, working to make it better. Turns out you can't really escape civilization, but you can help improve it. By 1840, I was 32 years old and honestly living my best life. My writing was successful enough that we could afford a bigger house. Still in Lewis, because why mess with a good thing? Eleanor was running her own school for girls by then, focusing on practical education rather than just accomplishments like embroidery and piano. Revolutionary stuff for the 1840s. Our daughter Catherine was 4 and already showing signs of inheriting my, let's call it, heightened awareness of social dynamics. She'd point at people in the market and whisper things like, "Mama, why does that man make me feel scared?" 9 times out of 10, she was picking up on something real: domestic abusers, thieves, people with bad intentions. Eleanor and I had to have some interesting conversations about how to handle having a child with what appeared to be supernatural intuition about danger. Do you encourage it? Ignore it? Teach them to trust their instincts while also functioning normally in society. We decided on radical honesty, age-appropriate but honest. When Kathy asked why certain people made her feel uncomfortable, We'd explain concepts like manipulation, power imbalances, and predatory behavior in terms a child could understand. Some people try to hurt others because they're angry or sad inside. We'd tell her, "Your feelings about people are trying to protect you, so we should listen to them, but we also need to be fair and kind to people who haven't actually done anything wrong yet." It sounds like we were raising a tiny detective, but honestly, we were just trying to raise a woman who would be harder to victimize. After everything I'd seen Maria Martin trusting the wrong person, Mary Patterson and all those vulnerable people targeted by Burke and Hare, I was determined that my daughter would have every possible advantage when it came to spotting danger. By the time she was 8, Kathy could spot a con artist from across a room. She'd tug on Eleanor's skirt and whisper, "That man is lying about something important." And she was always right. Always. It was both impressive and slightly terrifying. In 1842, something happened that would test everything I'd learned about crime, investigation, and using my weird abilities for good. Our neighbor, Mrs. Whitmore's sweet old lady, made excellent jam, went missing. Now, the local constable was convinced she'd just wandered off in confusion. Mrs. Whitmore was in her 70s, and she'd been getting a bit forgetful lately. "Probably got lost in the woods," he said. "We'll find her in a day or two, confused but unharmed." But something felt wrong, really wrong. The same kind of wrongness I'd felt in that meadow where Eleanor and I had our ill-fated picnic proposal. My murder radar was going absolutely haywire, and Kathy, now 8 years old, took one look at Mrs. Whitmore's nephew, who'd come to help with the search, and immediately hid behind Eleanor's skirts. "He's bad, Papa," she whispered to me. "He makes my stomach feel sick." And looking at this guy, clean-cut, well-dressed, saying all the right concerned things, I realized she was absolutely right. There was something performative about his grief, something calculated about his concern. For the first time in my adult life, I decided to actively investigate instead of just observing. I started asking questions around town, casual-like. What was Mrs. Whitmore's relationship with her nephew? Who stood to benefit if something happened to her? Turns out, Mrs. Whitmore was quite wealthy, owned several properties around town that she'd inherited from her late husband, and her will left everything to her nephew, Thomas, who happened to be deeply in debt from gambling. But here's where it gets interesting. I started tracking Thomas's movements the day his aunt went missing. Talked to shopkeepers, stable boys, anyone who might have seen him. And slowly, I pieced together a timeline that didn't match his story at all. He claimed he'd been home all morning, then came to check on his aunt around noon and found her missing. But the baker saw him leading a confused-looking elderly woman toward the woods at dawn. The blacksmith saw him coming back alone, carrying a shovel around mid-morning. I could have gone to the constable with my suspicions, but honestly, after witnessing how thoroughly the authorities had bungled the early stages of both the Red Barn case and Burke and Hare, I wasn't confident they'd handle it properly. Instead, I decided to confront Thomas directly. Eleanor thought I was insane. "You're a writer, not a constable." But I had this burning need to do something. For once in my life, I wasn't going to just witness a crime and write about it afterward. I was going to prevent a killer from getting away with murder. I found Thomas at the local tavern, 3 days after his aunt's disappearance, drinking heavily and telling anyone who'd listen how worried he was. I sat down next to him and started talking about the weather, local gossip, normal stuff. Then I casually mentioned that I'd been thinking about writing a piece about missing persons cases, how they're investigated, what techniques work best for finding people who vanished. Fascinating how many people go missing in wooded areas, I said. Almost like someone who knew the local terrain could hide a body there quite effectively. The change in his expression was immediate. Guilt, fear, and calculation all flashing across his face in the space of a heartbeat. That's when I knew for certain that Kathy and I were right about him. What happened next was like something out of one of those sensationalized crime plays, except it was real life and I was somehow the protagonist instead of just the audience. Thomas started sweating, stammering, trying to change the subject. So I pressed harder. I've developed quite an expertise in murder cases over the years. Witnessed several investigations firsthand. It's amazing how often the killer is someone close to the victim, someone who stands to benefit financially. That's when he broke. Just completely cracked under the pressure. Started babbling about how it was an accident. How his aunt had threatened to cut him out of her will when she found out about his debts. How he'd only meant to scare her, but she'd fallen and hit her head. I kept him talking while the tavern keeper, who'd been listening to the whole conversation, sent his son to fetch the constable. By the time the authorities arrived, Thomas had confessed to everything and even told us where he'd buried the body. Mrs. Whitmore was found exactly where he said she'd be, in a shallow grave about 2 miles into the woods. The coroner confirmed that she died from a blow to the head, probably not accidental, given the force required. Thomas was tried, convicted, and hanged within 6 months. The whole thing was much less dramatic than the Corder or Burke cases. No massive crowds, no souvenirs, just quiet local justice for a quiet local crime. But for me, it was huge. For the first time since I'd left home 15 years earlier, I'd actively prevented a killer from getting away with murder. I'd used everything I'd learned from witnessing those famous cases to solve a crime in real time. Eleanor was proud but terrified. What if he'd been violent? She asked. What if he'd decided to silence you instead of confessing? Fair points, but I'd been careful. The confrontation was public. I'd made sure other people knew what I was doing, and honestly, Thomas was more of a desperate coward than a calculating killer. The best part was Kathy's reaction. When I told her, in age-appropriate terms, that the bad man who'd hurt Mrs. Whitmore had been caught, she just nodded seriously and said, "Good. He made my tummy feel sick." Then she went back to playing with her dolls like nothing had happened. That's when I realized we'd successfully raised a child who trusted her instincts about people but didn't let fear dominate her life. She could sense danger, but she didn't live in constant anxiety about it. That felt like a parenting win. The Mrs. Whitmore case changed my writing in profound ways. Instead of just analyzing crimes that had already happened, I started writing about crime prevention. How to recognize dangerous people, warning signs of domestic violence, teaching children to trust their instincts, practical guides that might actually save lives. My publisher was initially skeptical. People want entertainment, he said. They want to read about famous murders, not boring prevention techniques. But it turned out there was a huge market for practical safety advice, especially among women who were tired of being told to just be careful, without any specifics about what to be careful about. I started getting letters from readers, women who'd recognized manipulative behavior in their suitors because of something I'd written, parents who'd taught their children to spot predatory adults, even constables who'd used my techniques to solve local cases. It felt incredible to know that all the horrible things I'd witnessed were actually helping people stay safe. Instead of just entertaining people with stories about murder, I was potentially preventing murders from happening in the first place. By 1845, I was approaching 40 and had somehow become a minor celebrity in the world of crime prevention and social reform. I was invited to speak at conferences, consult on legal cases, even advise the government on prison reform policies. Eleanor and I had 2 more children, a son named Frederick in 1843 and another daughter, Alice, in 1845. All 3 kids inherited some version of my intuitive abilities, though they manifested differently in each child. Kathy remained the most sensitive to dangerous people, but she also developed an amazing ability to help traumatized individuals feel safe. She'd end up becoming a pioneering social worker, specializing in helping women escape violent situations. Frederick had an uncanny ability to spot lies and deception. He could tell when people were being dishonest about anything, not just dangerous things, but also petty lies, exaggerations, even harmless white lies. He became a barrister and was legendary for his ability to crack witness testimony. Little Alice, well, she was still a toddler, but she had this way of making even the most hardened criminals break down and confess when she looked at them with her big, innocent eyes. We joked that she'd either become a detective or a priest. 1847, 20 years after I'd first heard about Maria Martin's disappearance, I received a letter that would bring everything full circle. A young man, couldn't have been more than 19 or 20, had read my early pamphlets about the Red Barn murder and the Burke and Hare case. He was planning to leave his family home to seek adventure and mystery in the world, and he wanted my advice about how to find interesting cases to investigate. Sound familiar? I wrote him back immediately. Dear young man, I said, I understand the desire for adventure and mystery, but please learn from my experience. You don't need to seek out crime and violence to find meaning in life. Instead, seek out ways to prevent crime and violence. The adventure isn't in witnessing horror, it's in stopping horror from happening. I invited him to visit us in Lewis, to see what a life built around crime prevention rather than crime fascination could look like. He came for a weekend and ended up staying for 6 months, learning everything Eleanor and I could teach him about recognizing danger, helping victims, and turning traumatic experiences into tools for good. His name was Jonathan Hartwell, and he'd go on to become one of the most famous criminal investigators of the Victorian era. But instead of just solving crimes after they happened, he specialized in preventing them. He credited our conversations with changing the entire direction of his life. That's when I realized that maybe everything I'd been through, the wandering, the trauma, the horrible things I'd witnessed, had been leading up to this. Not just to help me build a good life for myself and my family, but to help other people avoid the mistakes I'd made and find better ways to channel their curiosity about human nature. So here I am, 39 years old, looking back on a life that started with running away from responsibility and somehow ended up as a testament to finding purpose in the most unexpected places. If there's one thing I want you to take away from this marathon storytelling session, it's this. You don't have to witness tragedy to understand it. You don't have to experience trauma to learn from it. And most importantly, You don't have to let darkness define your story. You can choose to let it motivate your light. I spent years thinking I was cursed to be around death and violence. Turns out I was blessed with the ability to recognize it and do something about it. The difference between a curse and a gift is often just perspective and what you choose to do with it. Maria Martin, Mary Patterson, Daft Jamie, Mrs. Whitmore, they didn't get to choose what happened to them, but I got to choose what their deaths meant for my life. I could let their murders make me cynical and afraid, or I could let their stories inspire me to protect other people from similar fates. Eleanor helped me see that trauma doesn't have to be the end of your story. It can be the beginning of your purpose. Our children are living proof that you can acknowledge the darkness in the world without letting it consume you. I'm not wandering anymore. Haven't been for years. I found my place, my people, my purpose. But in a way, I'm still that curious kid who left home looking for adventure. I just learned that the best adventures involve making the world a little bit safer for the people you care about. If you've made it this far in this absolute novel of a video, you're probably the kind of person who appreciates long-form storytelling and deep dives into human psychology. That tells me something about you. You're not just looking for quick entertainment. You want to understand things, to learn something meaningful. So here's my final piece of advice, from one seeker to another. Whatever you're running toward or running from, remember that the most interesting stories aren't always about witnessing extraordinary events. Sometimes they're about taking ordinary experiences and finding extraordinary ways to use them to help other people. The world will always have its share of William Corders and Burke and Hares. But it also has people like Eleanor, like Mrs. Whitmore's neighbors who cared when she went missing, like that young man Jonathan who chose prevention over fascination with violence. Be one of the good ones. And if you accidentally stumble into history in the making like I did, remember, you always have a choice about what role you play in that history. Thanks for taking this journey with me from wandering boy to settled man. From trauma survivor to someone who found a way to transform pain into purpose. If this story resonated with you, if it made you think about your own relationship with adventure, danger, and finding your place in the world, then maybe all those dark Victorian nights were worth it. Hit that like button if you appreciate storytelling that doesn't shy away from difficult topics but also doesn't glorify them. Subscribe if you want more deep dives into how historical events shaped real people's lives. And share this with anyone who might be struggling to find meaning in their own difficult experiences. Until next time, remember, the best adventures are the ones where everyone gets to go home safely at the end. The wanderer finally at rest.